with the setup of the roundtable today, I usually do this kind of faux Phil Donahue routine. I've already taken off my coat. It's going to get, no chairs will be thrown. But Phil Donahue, no one's, I'm the only thing I know. It happens to us all. I know Oprah was after my time. Okay. So we have some important issues, and I want to lay the table again for what the purpose of the roundtable is. It is to try to take us from a basis of all the rich conversation we've had, learning more about the condition as it's experienced by patients and families, wonderful input from clinical experts given the arc of the innovation that they're seeing and how it's affecting practice and their patients' lives. We've talked a lot about, obviously, the evidence in the published trials, the cost effectiveness. And now we're going to try to pivot and talk about what's coming ahead. And we're going to, yes, talk about how this translates through into the way that patients should experience the healthcare system. How should they work with doctors and insurers? How should insurers work with clinical experts to identify best practice and set up what every insurer has to do, which is some piece of paper that says what has to happen before coverage and payment will be authorized, and how all that fits in a world in which the pricing and the payment for these kinds of treatments are obviously something of great importance, not just to the SMA community, but to the country as a whole. So I have, sad to say, at least 16 different questions that I'd like to ask in the next hour and about 10, 15 minutes. But I want to start with the patients again, because this conversation will range far and afield over the next hour or so. And I wanted to really start with today, before we go into the future. Do you guys know, and I'll ask Mary too to kick in. Oh shoot, I didn't even introduce new people. I apologize. Before I get started with that, let's recognize the new folks who have stepped up to the policy roundtable. You've met Doug Sproul and Mary Schroth. Okay, every name I'm getting wrong. Apologies. Say it again. Schroth. Okay, I'll get that. Danielle and Brandy, Emma and David. Now, Chris and John and Eric, why don't you please introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Steve. My name is Chris Lightman. I head up our Global Value and Access Organization at Biogen. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, both as a company and as an individual, on a US-based policy topic. I just moved back from Europe about 6 months ago, where I spent the last 3 years there, a good part of launching and supporting patient access for Spinraza across Europe. So it's very enlightening for me to hear some of the discussions today here, which are very similar and in some ways very different than what's happening
but
in
better,
Europe. Delighted.
But better.
But better, more enlightened.
Thank you, Chris. I know you had to say that. John.
I am Joan Watkins. I manage the drug formulary involved in medical policy, which is coverage criteria for Premera Blue Cross, which is a 2 million member health plan in Washington State. Also affiliate professor of pharmacy at the University of Washington. And I appreciate everything I've heard so far today. These meetings are extremely valuable for us just in terms of understanding some of the very complex issues around a condition like this, and things that there's no way that you would know if you don't listen. The evidence gives us a black and white picture. I need patients and the people that care for them to paint the colors for me.
Thanks. Eric?
Yeah, thanks. So my name.
Please, I'll ask everybody to remember to pull the mic until it sounds like you're booming off the
Eric
back
Schindler,
wall.
Clinical Pharmacy Manager with United Healthcare. I am responsible for the review and clinical development of clinical programs for specialty medications and have focused on rare conditions and have been involved with the development and review of the Spinraza program and the draft Zolgensma program since its inception. Thank you for having me here today. I know you've asked me to be here to represent the payer perspective, but I hope what's not lost in my comments is the concern, compassion, and empathy for the patients and families with this condition.
Okay, thank you, and welcome, everybody. So this is a relatively large roundtable, too, which is going to make it challenging for us to follow along all the different perspectives. But let me focus in again first with the patients. And Mary, please feel free to complement this, because what I'd like to ask is, what are the barriers today to access that we need to focus on from a policy perspective? What are the insurance barriers, the barriers to finding the right clinician? What are the things that we want to highlight as a report goes out on how the access for patients can be improved? Do you guys have comments on that, or however you want to share this with Mary, because I know Mary's been thinking about this a lot.
Well, I still see a barrier of how many places are dosing, or how many places that people can go to get treatment. So I will often see in the community people asking, where are you going, or how can I get our local hospital or whatnot involved with doing it. So that's a barrier. I think insurance has been less of a barrier as time has gone on. Those things take time, but it seems like people are getting access to it or getting it approved, but making sure to be able to find a place that you trust to go to is still something that
So
we're
how do
working on.
patients find where to go to these days? I mean, haven't they already been seeing an SMA specialist? I'd be surprised if they were, or what I mean,
Well,
when you say that, how is it?
I mean, in the adult community, and other people
Yeah.
can speak to this, no. I mean, so I have had the opportunity because my daughter is type 3A, so basically means she's a younger type 3. So she was diagnosed very young. She didn't walk into elementary age or high school like you might hear some other type 3 diagnosed people talk about. So some people might say is like a weak type 3. So we were connected, but a lot, because she's type 3, I've gotten involved with other type 3 individuals who are older adults. Lots of those adults don't see they see their primary care doctor, or they'll see a neurologist maybe every couple of years, or I mean, it's not the same. So especially for adults, finding sites that have individuals who are able to dose and understand SMA and have that background is important. But even with kids, there are some families that I've talked to who they don't have a place to go, or they didn't immediately have a place to go for that, for the dosing.
Exactly as you said, Danny. Many of the adult patients had stopped going to their neurologist who had made the diagnosis because what we were hearing is that the neurology and neuromuscular clinics had nothing to offer them. So they were seeking sporadic care at best. But then when Spinraza became available, was approved, we heard from our adult community. They started coming forward, and Emma and David can attest to this, wanting better care, wanting access to these therapies. But that had been a population that sort of fell between the cracks, if you will.
So now can they go to to Cure SMA's website and find a national map and drill down and find a zip code? And is it that easy these days?
Yes, we have a locator on our website that lists sites that are willing to be listed on our website. There are additional sites out there that provide Spinraza, but we have that available to support our families.
And are basically, if a clinician raises his or her hand and says, I can do this, are insurers saying fine, or are they setting up centers of excellence and you have to go to one of those? Because again, with ultra-rare disorders, sometimes there is a level of expertise where payers will set up a network for a variety of reasons and try to funnel patients there. Is that the way it's working with Spinraza, or is it pretty much everywhere that someone can do it?
And again, I'll have the clinician step
You guys
in,
know?
but from our perspective, what we've seen is it's those centers that are able to build the infrastructure to provide the medication are those that are offering it.
Yeah, I think that's at least the minimum, to have that infrastructure, but to also have multidisciplinary clinics where these patients can be followed with experts in physical and occupational therapy, to make sure they're getting the optimal pulmonary care and speech therapy. And you wouldn't want to waste the potential benefits of this amazing drug by just giving it and not following up with all the rest that can help them take the full advantage of it. So at least in California, the state insurer for these disabled patients, called California Children's Services, or CCS, has mandated that children receiving payment for the drug through them be seen in a neuromuscular team center with all of the support available.
But that is a very important point because it's very actually heterogeneous around the country. Different states have very different policies. Like New York is very heterogeneous, although I have seen policies that specifically require a neuromuscular specialist to prescribe, Spinraza and other, complex drugs. I have also seen and heard many patients saying, I'm getting Spinraza through a neurosurgeon in the OR, like crazy stuff that really does not make sense, and clearly someone is paying for that. So there is no homogeneous policy to set some standards of, yes, we give you this drug, but you need still standard of care, you need this, this, and this, and no, you shouldn't get general anesthesia every 4 months, So, yeah, some states are better than others, but there is a lot of heterogeneity.
So you would suggest then that payers, a national payer like United, should have some criteria for the clinical setting in which Spinraza, and I'm assuming Avexis's drug, Zolgensma, would be delivered? So a criteria saying a neuromuscular specialist, multidisciplinary team, would there be a checklist that you think should be established or not?
I think that at the end of the day, if the payers reach out to experts in rare diseases and listen to, some criteria that, and there are many here because, yes, there is the drug indicated or not indicated? What kind of outcome measure are you going to measure to say, how long of a trial is a reasonable trial? So those three are the big ones, right? Why don't you ask the expert, is the Hammersmith or the CHOP or the 6 minutes walk, rather than I find the letter telling me that I have to do, an Hammersmith on someone that, has been in a wheelchair for 10 years. It doesn't make any sense. So those are the big ones. But then there are more nuances, right? Yes, are you able to deliver also the standard of care? What are you doing with your anesthesia? So reach out to the expert early. What happened with Spinraza is that in some states, for a year, we didn't know anything about what payers will do, and nobody reached out to the experts, so there was absolutely no communication of kind of setting a ground of, policy. I think that would be very crucial.
Eric, do you mind if I ask you real quickly, as you
Sure.
think as a national insurer about that question, there's always a tension between setting up criteria for excellence that might reduce access if there are too few places that can do that. So how are you splitting that difference with SMA?
Yeah, so in our criteria, we do require prescription or by or in consultation with the specialist.
By the way, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah,
By
it is.
or
It-
with,
it-
or
it
in
is.
consultation with.
It is, and we don't have a defined list of that, because whenever we draft the criteria, if we agree with the benefit shown in the evidence, we try our best to not put up any unnecessary barrier for access. And so, and review of our utilization has pretty much consistently showed a clustering around the major academic centers. And so with our policy, we have that. And then with an initial authorization, we there's not any set functional criteria early on, but we do request that, one of the compilation of assessments are going to take place, whether it's Hine, whether it's CHOP and 10, whether it's upper limb module, Hammersmith, what have you. Not that there's a baseline function to get in, but just an acknowledgement that one of those baseline tests will be helpful to continue the evaluation going forward, and not that there's an aha moment 6 months later.
We'll talk about that aha moment, because some insurers at least will think about a renewal criterion around some outcome measure, but we'll come back to that. Why don't I just jump the shark here and say, so 12-0, low value, long-term value for money. Is any insurer in the United States going to say, oh, now I'm not going to cover Spinraza because it's low value. The price is too high, therefore I'm not going to cover it. Is that going to happen?
I don't see that happening here. Now, to give a counterexample, there have been some payers that have not wanted to cover Exondys 51, which interestingly came out at about the same time as Spinraza did. It had very minimal evidence and no outcomes of any clinical significance. The entire case was based on an intermediate marker that was thought to be some evidence of benefit. So there were insurers that pushed back on that one. We did cover it, but there were others that didn't. However, I don't see, when we talk about low value in this setting, we are talking about low value for the money, as you said. That does not mean that there's lack of clinical value. If something has a very high ICER, there are two likely explanations. One is it's not all that good. The other is it's just overpriced. So Spinraza would fall into the high value category if you bring the price down enough so that the ICER drops below whatever threshold you have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, at least with United Healthcare, when Spinraza was initially launched, I think there were some payers that restricted it to just the infantile onset population. I think United Healthcare was one of the first payers that provide a broader access to the later onset. And to Dr. Watkins' point was, that there's been a number of these ICER assessments for a very number of specialty products over the years. And when you look at just the overall magnitude of qualities gained by these innovations, the qualities gained by either of these products by the model when given early on in therapy are larger than any of the quality gains shown in any other assessment. And the only assessment that it rivals is that of Kymriah for pediatric ALL.
Yeah, and we'll return to that as an interesting case study in the future. Okay, so we got that out of the way. We'll come back to it, but it's at least we've had it addressed up front at the beginning. So I want to turn back to the clinical experts and try to get out of your way. Don't always look at me. Look at the lovely camera at the back. But let's talk, because there's going to be a back and forth between clinical experts and payers. Manufacturers will be involved in the discussions, but there's going to be, hopefully, a lot of positive back and forth between the clinical expert community and payers around how to put pen to paper and come up with coverage criteria. They're already in existence for Spinraza, but now we have Zolgensma, likely, we think, coming down the pike. First, let's just talk about what the clinicians are viewing as the next kind of move in the field. Is everybody going to be treated presymptomatically first? Is there going to be any waiting anymore with screening now? And I'll raise the difficult question of an article that was published by a set of experts in the US that said that they were divided, but did not suggest that treatment should start if there were 4 or more copies of SMN2. That you could screen, treat everybody else, not saying which one yet, with either Zolgensma or Spinraza, but if the SMN2 copy was 4 or greater, you would wait and see if they developed clinical symptoms. Is that the way the world is going, that likely both of these drugs are going to be used presymptomatically, except in that case? What do you think?
I think that's absolutely where the field is going, that with the newborn screening becoming more awfully universally available in awfully in short time, yes, we're going to treat neurodegenerative disease such as SMA presymptomatically, which is obviously is the way to go to make it really worth it from every perspective, outcomes, value, whatever. The experts are split 50-50 when it comes to the 4 copies presymptomatic. So obviously we need better biomarkers or way to really define what's symptomatic. Fortunately, the 4 copies are less frequent, but definitely for 2 and 3 copies, none of the clinician and expert have doubts that the presymptomatic stage is the way to go. So that's the way of the future. The worst nightmare for us clinicians is to be in the room with the newly identified 7-days-old baby presymptomatic, having 2 fabulous drugs, whichever way you look at it. I mean, they both sound phenomenal. if used pre-symptomatically, and now you have to spend 3 months, you know, doing peers-to-peers or delaying because of other issues of, you know.
So let's talk about
That's
that.
the-
So, yes, because the current patient population hasn't experienced that, but the coming patient population of pre-symptomatic findings will. And I want to wrap in the type 0, which really didn't come up much today. I know it's not very common, but again, if there are patients or neonates who are born for whom you want to try to get treatment as quickly as possible, type 0, type 1 are obviously, based on the SMN number. So how is the payer community going to work with this system so that right now it takes how long do you think on average between a pre-symptomatic diagnosis at birth and the first treatment that can be delivered? How long?
I can say that in New York State, we will have confirmation of diagnosis somewhere between day 7 and 14, I think,
Okay.
generally. How quickly could we treat?
Yeah.
If you're a center for Spinraza, if you're a center that you're up and running, you could get it the next day.
You can, okay. So insurance can be turned around that quickly?
Well, I haven't been in that situation yet where I particularly practice, but I think that I will say yes, with the 2 and 3 copies, I hope that there will be no delays. I hope that I am correct.
Chris, have you had this, Eric, have you had this come through your offices at this point, a growing number of pre-symptomatic diagnoses, and how quickly?
Absolutely, and
So what happens?
we've made that, not adjustment, but from the very beginning, we anticipated that scenario. And, in the review of Spinraza, and then obviously Zolgensma coming down, have talked to specialists, and one of the focuses that I had was to do everything that was in my power to make sure that time window is shrunk as possible, to a point where I think that the longest maybe delay may actually be not clinical but supply chain. Because I think that whether you evaluate the ENDEAR study with the pre-specified analysis of less than 12 weeks, you take the NURTURE trial for the positive that we discussed, even though it's the data is not as the quality of the data, or the rigidity of the data is not as what we exist, but it's still strong. And then with the one-time application of the IV Zolgensma product, I think we know that that's probably where the community is going to, and we wanted to make sure that there's no rate-limiting step on our end.
Good. Back when I was practicing, we decided to come up with an internal guideline that no woman who had a breast biopsy should have to wait more than 48 hours to know what the result was. It was an internal timeline so that we didn't have patients being sent home saying, we'll call you, that's a ridiculous thing to tell a patient. So if we were to set a proposal, at least for a standard, that insurers across the country should be held to for turning around a request for coverage once a baby is diagnosed as having SMA with, let's say, 3 or fewer copies, what would we say should be, if we were literally able to write a reg that said every insurer has to come back with a response within X amount of days, what would it be? What's reasonable? Mary, has your group thought about this at all or not?
It should be within 7 days.
7 days? Can the insurers do that?
48 hours.
Ooh.
Which
a
I
no-brainer.
like. So we now consider the diagnosis of SMA to be an emergency.
It's like TPA.
It's like TPA.
Time is motor
All right. Ooh. Neurologists upon us. Time is brain.
Motor neurons.
Time is motor neurons.
We noticed symptoms in my son 5 days after birth. We were poo-pooed, but he had symptoms 5 days after birth.
Now I peer back at the insurers, okay? So what's realistic, quote unquote? What do you think we should hold the industry to?
We have a requirement, if the request is marked urgent, it should be turned around in 24 hours. By the way, just to pitch this, preaching to the choir probably, but the biggest reason why requests that should be approved don't get is because there's missing information. So if you have all the diagnostic information, everything that our policy asks for, then it should turn around quickly.
Yeah, doctors.
We sometimes
Okay, so
don't
we'll
get-
take a flying leap on this one, though. And I mean, whether it's 2 days, I mean, 7 days feels like an outside number. If I'm a
I
parent,
am happy to give that
if
up.
I'm a parent and if I'm a
24
parent
hours,
and I'm told by a doctor that every day is, I mean, obviously,
Neurons.
I hope doctors are better at their communication skills than to frame it that way. But the sense of urgency is real. I think we all feel that and would agree that health insurers really should view this as an emergency kind of situation. Okay. So let's move on the clinical expert scale to, we have a diagnosed presymptomatic patient. Now, I'm talking about Zolgensma as if it were FDA approved. I acknowledge that, and I'm putting, David's in a very tough spot because there are certain things he can and can't say before the drug, finalizes its process. So you may be burdened in lots of ways, but one right now is I'm going to ask the clinical experts, why wouldn't you use Zolgensma first? Is that what people are going to be doing presymptomatically? And then using Spinraza if symptoms start to appear, don't get better. What's going to be the mindset? If we don't have a clinical guideline, what are people like you going to do?
So I think we agree that our predisposition is to use the gene therapy first. For one, access is easier intravenously than intrathecally. For two, we actually think of type 1 SMA as a systemic disease, even though the cell death occurs in the spinal cord motor neurons. There's use of this protein in other cell types, and the gene therapy delivery model potentially has other benefits that we're not measuring yet, that we'll see in longer-term follow-up. But there is the caveat that the clinical trial that's been done so far was only including patients that did not have antibodies against the AAV9 vector. What are we going to do when patients already have that antibody? What if it's maternally transferred to the babies? So we're not going to have time to wait for it to clear from their systems. I was just talking to Eric a little bit about ideas for what to do, but really we just don't know yet. So there are going to be patients where we would want to give Zolgensma first, but we may have to bridge for a while with Spinraza. If they're doing great, maybe we wouldn't add a second therapy, but we're going to anticipate a lot of families are going to ask within the window of, age and size for approval for Zolgensma to switch over or maybe use both. So there's a lot that we don't yet know, but we're anticipating coming from desperate patients and families.
And again, we don't know what the FDA will do as far as a label. You guys have a presymptomatic trial in the field, right? Data coming in 2020?
So we currently have an ongoing presymptomatic study.
Yeah.
And that is,
Will the FDA have access to those data before they make their labeling decision?
they have access to our data, and they'll have certainly an interim. The study is ongoing at this point, to be completed as time goes on. But they have access to the interim data thus far.
Okay. Again, since I can speak completely hypothetically, I'm going to assume that they are going to approve it broadly for use in presymptomatic as well as other types of, well, maybe not type 2, 3, but certainly for type 1. And so I'll patch it back again to you, presymptomatic treatment. David Rind earlier offered, and I think Brian also said, is there a reason to maybe use Spinraza for a few months until the child gets older before you use Zolgensma, because we don't have that much data yet on the youngest babies? Is anybody thinking that way, or do you think it's going to be Zolgensma with Spinraza mop-up?
Not really, because I think we were still more inclined to think give the gene therapy first and then, consider Spinraza as add-on therapy later on. And I think that part of that is maybe, the lifelong, long-term issue with the repeated lumbar puncture maybe enters in that decision a little bit.
Okay. Hey, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so, right. So we touched on a few of the side effects seen in patients receiving intrathecal therapy, the kind of things that you might warn families about before even a lumbar puncture done diagnostically, headaches and backaches and things like that. Infections, although fairly low risk at major medical centers. We are seeing a small number of patients that have been getting repeated intrathecal infusions develop less anticipated side effects, including one of my patients recently who developed such severe intracranial hypotension that she developed bilateral subdural hematomas. The family hasn't even decided whether they want to resume therapy. So there's also been some reports of patients developing obstructive, or I guess non-obstructive hydrocephalus. And there may be kind of an unknown mechanism at play, but these are risks that we don't have to consider with gene therapy. And with such small babies, we're going to be a little more concerned about, livers that are not yet fully developed and how they handle inflammation. But we're also worried about their immature central nervous system and these other complications.
Okay. So from a payer perspective, I hear this, and maybe you've heard other things from different clinical experts, but is your instinct to keep both available for presymptomatic, or do you also steer patients and families towards coverage with one first? Do you have a kind of a vision of the pathway of care that you try to, in a sense, write down on paper and get people started that way? Or do you leave it up to, pre-symptomatic phase right now to the choice of the clinician?
We won't be trying to steer at this point. I was a little bit concerned about the issue of the newborn's liver function. Little kids are different. They handle drugs differently. But what I just heard from the experts makes me feel a little better about that. But there's still a certain amount of unknown risk there, and I would rather let the physician and the parents or whoever is making the decision for the family make that choice. Interestingly, if you go back to the Affordable Care Act debate in public, one of the things we heard loud and clear from the American public is they don't want anybody else other than their doctor guiding that decision. So with complex things like this, I think we need to allow some freedom for them to make the choice. Anything you do bears risk anytime you enter a healthcare system.
So think of some hypothetical insurer somewhere in the country who could be thinking, if they start on Spinraza, I know that they're going to want Zolgensma later. So why don't I cover Zolgensma first? And because the kid could do quite well with that, and then maybe not ask for Spinraza. But aren't I kind of setting it up for a family that asked for Spinraza first to come after Zolgensma in 6 months? And that it might not be the most cost-effective treatment pathway. Are there insurers that will think that way, or do you think they're going to say, at this stage, we have to just...
I say to John's point, I don't think we're considering that at this point. And to Dr. Michelson's point, or Mickelson, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and it may be getting into the minutiae of the disease, but I could see a scenario where someone needs to have that. Is it, if they're AAV positive, do we want to give them a drug that we're currently uncertain of, and maybe there's time we can do something later on that gets rid of the antibodies? A second point, and like I said, it's just hypothetical at this point. We don't know what the label is going to be. Right. I hope that it's broad for type 1 or likely type 1. But as for United Healthcare, we have a fully insured aspect of our business, and then we have self-insured clients. And some self-insured clients may rely on stop-loss vendors to cover that catastrophic aspect. We haven't really encountered it yet, but say, for example, the label is narrow and it's type 1 and symptomatic type 1 only. Mm-hmm. But there's the interest and there's the approval and then there's the access to the drug. But then the stop-loss vendor says this patient showed no signs of symptoms and it doesn't meet the label, and now that self-insured client is at risk. I don't know if that's going to occur, but it's not outside the realm of possibility.
All right. So let's move on from the presymptomatic to the type 1, because that's right now the most common population. And I assume that what % of type 1s are on Spinraza? All of them? These days? No?
Now, remember that when you think of incidence and prevalent cases, you're in completely different worlds,
Right.
of course. So many of the type 1 are now, maybe teenagers or, in clinics in real life. So some of those are not, they're not treated for, reason of complexity of delivery or really not really goals of improvement, So that's for the prevalence. So I would say that it's not 100%, but the majority of maybe more newly diagnosed,
Right.
younger type 1,
Okay.
I assume they are.
But I assume a really common scenario in the near future will be type 1 patients on Spinraza who are considering Zolgensma. And that may be a really complicated dynamic. Do they continue the Spinraza after taking Zolgensma? Will the insurance company let them do that? Will taking Zolgensma mean they have to stop Spinraza and it's been working pretty well and now they're going to switch horses? What are clinical...
I don't think that that's
what do you
going to
think?
be a very imminent or realistic scenario, and Doug can probably talk about this, but from what I've heard is that the approval for Zolgensma will be based on some sort of weight limit, which really have implication for, switching patients that are over a certain weight. Again, we don't know until we're going to see the label, but so for type 1 that are clinically already diagnosed, there will be some limitation based on the weight. So that.
Oh, I can just imagine the patient and family who are, 1.5 pounds over the threshold. A good little diet would get them eligible for the stress around this decision making. So I wasn't actually aware of the weight-based aspects that might factor in here. And again, you may not be able. I know you can't talk about your
You're putting me
label.
on the spot, and I can't
Sorry,
and
but
I
that's-
can't speculate on the FDA
I know.
FDA
I know.
discussions.
But that's what we
Or-
have heard.
Right, so not to step on what Doug knows so much more about, but right now giving this Zolgensma treatment intravenously means giving trillions, hundreds of trillions of copies of this virus and the DNA within it. And we don't know if that would be safe scaled up to an adult-sized patient. So we have concerns as clinicians too about doing that. And in the clinical trials that they've organized for older patients, they are using an intrathecal delivery to limit the exposure to the virus. So when the intravenous product is available, we're not going to be cavalier about giving it to older patients, even if we could.
Okay. That's a very helpful perspective. John, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just to clarify one thing, we certainly would not deny a patient because they're 1 pound or 1 kg over the weight limit. In most of the plans that I know are reasonable about things like that. The chances are you wouldn't even have to appeal that one.
All right.
Well, I would pose devil's advocate, and not that we would be strict with that, but to the point that they brought up is that it's a weight-based product that we don't know the limit of what is the top dose. And to a further point, I don't know the aspects of the trial, but the phase 1 trial at Dr. Mendel nationwide there was initially a 3-dose cohort. There was the low dose and the 3 patients that didn't work. There was the middle dose, which turned out to be the therapeutic dose, and then there was a 3rd dose that was 3.3 times 10 to the 14. And that was in the initial thing, and that was cut. I don't know why it was cut, but I have to assume that there was potentially a dose-limiting toxicity or a concern of such. So if the FDA does put a dose restriction on that, and it's for a safety rationale, then I think we'll probably adhere to that.
Okay.
What I said wasn't
ahead.
meant to apply to that situation. Obviously, if there's a substantial weight difference, that's a whole different story.
Right.
We would undoubtedly do a peer-to-peer call in that situation.
Okay. So let's move on. I want to spend in about 30 minutes. I want to cover the rest of some of the coverage issues that may come up and then talk a fair amount about payment mechanisms and different ways that the health system is thinking about managing treatments like this from that perspective. So, if you look at the way that Canada, for instance, recently updated its coverage recommendations, its central health technology assessment group puts out recommendations that each province can then take under its own process and make a final decision, and Quebec always does it some way differently. But they have what could read like coverage criteria, which starts with the age of onset. It determines kind of a certain timing of the symptom onset, and largely this is matching the eligibility criteria from the pivotal trials. They do limit it to certain copies of SMN in terms of what's recommended and what's not. And they talk a little bit about the severity. So a patient, for instance, who has been able to walk is not eligible. If they're a type 3 and they can walk, they're not eligible for Spinraza. I hope I'm getting this right. I should bring it up on my laptop. But let's think about here in the US, as you're developing the criteria, not for presymptomatic, but for type 1, 2, and 3. You must already obviously have your coverage criteria. So do you use age of onset, SMN copy number, severity in some way? For instance, there's one guideline that says if patients have had the condition and are so severely affected that they have bad scoliosis, limited muscle function available, it may not help them very much. Their ability to benefit might not be that notable. On the other hand, also in that same article, it talks about even minor changes to motor function, the ability to move a joystick on a wheelchair, et cetera, can make a major difference in their overall kind of functioning. So how have you structured your coverage for Spinraza? And do you think there's any way that conceptually might shift as you think about what could be your coverage criteria for Zolgensma? Age of onset, number of SMN2 copies, how are you using that all today?
We usually, in a situation like that, we start by reading whatever guidelines are out there. Chances are this one will probably be, in our world, will be addressed by the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. They tend to convene a panel of clinical experts, and based on their advice, we'll probably come up with, they don't control what individual blue plans do, but they create template policies which we can choose to adopt. In this space, I'm hoping we will stay fairly close together. One of the reasons for that is because the complexities of our system, medical coverage is more complicated when you're outside of our principal states. And so you have a situation where it's less confusing to all concerned if the policies align across the whole system.
So for Spinraza right now, though, do you guys have language that says symptoms begin at this age or that age?
No.
You just have a genetic basis and
Yeah.
nothing else? You cover type 2 and type 3 just like type 1?
Yeah, we have not
Correct.
blocked that, no.
All right. Eric, what do you think? And
Yeah,
again,
so-
I know you're here partly telling us what your own insurance company does, but you may, even though you're not supposed to talk specifics unless it's in the public domain, but have you heard about other insurers and how they're applying it? I'm just getting out the Canadian guidelines
Yeah,
because they are controversial. But
Yeah, I think Canadian may, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Canadian maybe only cover type 1. And that was the decision of a couple of other payers when it first came out. But we covered Spinraza for the broad type 1, type 2, type 3 from almost the inception, with the one caveat that all of the clinical trials with Spinraza, Zolgensma, had a baseline threshold of 2 SMN2 copies. Now, one SMN2 copy is very rare. I think there was an article that was less than 0.5 cases of all SMA, and we haven't had any negative feedback on that. So our criteria is genetic confirmation of disease, 2+ copies so that there would be some expectation of chance of efficacy, and then, like I said, genetic diagnosis, and then baseline tests to evaluate it going forward.
Chris, you must
Yeah.
really want to talk
Yeah,
about
so
now.
I just wanted to clarify a little bit here
Please do.
on, because I think the experiences that you just shared there have actually followed a little bit what's happened in the US, which is there had never been a treatment before. It was a rush to us. So even some of the center readiness, keep in mind, we as a company, while we were preparing, it happened faster, and approvals happened faster, and reimbursement happened faster, and this has been a case worldwide. So I think it speaks to, early engagement and collaboration, but I just want to acknowledge that, this has just gone really fast in this entire community, and I have no doubt for future treatments it'll be the same. In the case of coverage policies, everyone was trying to understand the data and what we had. And obviously we had some data, then we had more, and then we continue to grow with more over the last 2.5 years. And what we've seen in coverage policies is in cases that weren't like UHC, where it was open from the beginning, if they had coverage restrictions that took time to work through, or where Biogen provided free drug during that period through our patient assistance program, ultimately, most and many of those coverage policies have changed. In the case of Canada, it's been very similar. The initial assessment of CADIT was a type 1. They did the reassessment. Now you see new criteria recently. But keep in mind, CADIT, like many other HTA-like bodies around the world, they provide one piece of information, and then it goes to another group. And so they've looked at the evidence and come up with criteria based on that. But of course, Biogen's been working with each of the Canadian provinces to ensure that it will look similar to some of these other places. And we already have Quebec, which has been very public. They have no coverage restrictions. And so the CADIT information is new, and now it will expand upon that. But I wouldn't want people to walk out with the belief that Canadian patients are severely restricted, because that's not the case.
So here in the US right now, how much diversity is there in insurance coverage policy? Is it pretty much uniform, or are you still seeing some important differences? I think we heard from the clinical experts that they were still, maybe it's around the margins of type 2 and 3, I'm not sure, but what's your knowledge of what we're seeing? We may have shifted the mean or the mode, but what diversity do we still have?
Yeah, so we still do have, as I said, it's definitely expanded over the last 2 years substantially. And we still do see tracheostomy, restrictions. We still see some.
Just to be clear, that means if the child
If the child
requires
is already
one,
on
then
permanent ventilation or tracheostomies, there could be restrictions there that take time to work through.
Right.
We do have situations in which, there are age criteria and restrictions that take time to work through that may be at 15 or older. And so because of that, it's no secret, and we've been very public about, to help work through that. I believe the first year that the drug was approved, 20% of the vials were free, as we helped get coverage policies in place, as we worked with sites to help them understand the protocols. And so that's continuing to evolve, but I would say now that's very different. Even for type 2 adults, we have a number of patients, and every month we add more adult patients as people become more aware of the benefits.
Did you guys have something to add on from the clinical expert community? Are you guys feeling like the diversity is shrinking and it's moving in the same direction? What still sticks in the craw, so to speak?
It took a little while for each different insurer in the state of California to work out what its policy would be, which delayed care for some of our patients, and some of that was limited, fortunately, by the access to drug program that Biogen provided. But we are having more and more of our older type 2 and type 3 patients coming back now, deciding they want to try the drug, or that hear about it and contact us from other centers. And there are insurers that are still denying those patients. So
Because they're over age 15? Is that the current policy that
I
some are
have
still
patients
using?
that are 56 years old that want to be treated, and they get treatment and they show benefits. So again, it might not meet any of our ICER criteria for long-term value, but if they have access to the drug and they see a benefit to it, they want to continue.
Okay. Do you anticipate, again, with Zolgensma coming in now, do you think some of the payers will refine their coverage criteria to focus in more on the SMN copy number, or in any other way to distinguish what
Remember,
coverage should look like?
the correlation between phenotype and number of SMN2 copies is not algorithmic.
Right.
It's a general correlation, and it's more reliable for the low number for 2 copies, but as you get more copies, it's not 100%, so it's not so black and white. So I think the policies based on number of SMN2 copies can be extremely dangerous. And early on, when Spinraza was approved, I will see payers pay for someone who had 2 copies, but it might have been on a trachea event with contractures, and were really medically very little hope to significant improvement, but they will pay for that, but they will not pay for a teenager type 3 with 3 or 4 copies who's on the verge of losing ambulation versus going to college on their feet, where as the doctor, obviously that will be a much more, relevant case to initiate therapy. So we hope that we're not gonna go through that mistake with the Zolgensma.
So are there any patients, and you guys can answer, or you guys can answer, I probably think are the most relevant, or Mary, feel free to jump in. This is kind of framed in a kind of an almost devil's advocate way. But are there any patients in coverage criteria who are too severely affected? You said ventilated and with contractures, or too healthy to merit coverage for Spinraza or Zolgensma at this point, or not? Because a lot of the, at least Canadians and others will be talking about not too sick, not too healthy, and that's something, age is kind of mixed in with that. But is there a rationale behind that approach to insurance coverage or not?
Well,
John, you want to dive in? Because your current coverage policy may or may not say anything about severity or age, but it may.
Yeah, we had a conversation with the local expert at the time.
Yeah.
I asked the question, what about type 4? She said, we never even see any of them. They don't come in. Haven't had any requests, but we have not limited. One of the things I learned from that conversation was the importance of arm strength in patients with type 2, type 3, as well as their ambulatory ability. And we're talking here independence, which is very important to patients, and from a societal perspective, this is a person that we want to be able to have a fairly normal lifespan, to be able to have a job, contribute to society. Those are all things that are a very important purpose, I think, of medical care and of insurance, is to give people the best chance they can to do that. So one of the things she pointed out I thought was interesting is arm strength may enable you to operate the joystick on a vehicle. Right. So there are vans, as I understand, that you can get with special equipment that people can drive, but obviously you have to be able to operate the controls well enough to do that.
So Eric, anything?
Yeah, and I'll cop to it because I have 2 experts to the left, and I'm always trying to learn about this condition. We do have futility criteria in our policy, which is probably more apt to the type 1 patients, as we talked about. And part of our futility criteria, which I think aligns with the CADTH original recommendations, is that if a patient deteriorates to a point where they do require permanent ventilation, that meets our futility criteria. And I think that that's also consistent with, at least in the model for ICER, is that there was no interim benefits provided in the model for treatment, as interim milestones aren't to be expected. So by definition, at that time, that value would be dominated or infinite. And so we have made that acknowledgement that, at a trade-off of broad access for everyone to give them the chance, with the fair innings or the rule of rescue, there's that broad access. But if it gets to that point, that currently meets our futility criteria. And so I would love to see what your opinion is on that.
Yeah.
Can
please. Please, Mary, go ahead.
So I think this situation, we have a lot of patients who were not part of clinical trials, who were trach and vent dependent prior to having these therapies. So I think bottom line is there's not enough data to derive that one way or the other. When we're looking at the population who did not have the opportunity to receive Spinraza prior to being trach and vent dependent. So I think that will depend on collecting real world data and evidence in those patient populations, and similarly for the type 4s or the adult onset I think we need more information before we say you can't have it. So I would really push back on those exclusions. I don't think we have enough information. I mean, families report to us how the benefits that they have seen, because there are a number of patients, and I'm sure Emma and David have them in their clinic, of families who are receiving, or individuals who are trach and vent dependent, who are receiving these therapies, who report benefits. I mean, they're able to now use their finger to use their iPad or to do some form of communication.
So I guess the point is you don't want to take a trach and event absolutely as a yes or no without putting it in the context of the remaining motor function and cognitive function in that particular patient in front of you, because not all trach and vent patients really goals of care could still have quite a bit of salvageable quality of life from a clinician patient point of view. So I don't think the vent and trach out of context as an absolute for denial is reasonable. Is that what?
I agree. I mean, I think patients should, our point at QRSMA is access for those families and patients that want to try these drugs to see if it does.
And I greatly appreciate that perspective. I really do. And I think that one of the difficulties or challenges for that is how to attempt to quantify or even rationalize is that, so at that point of the disease, what's keeping that patient alive is the ventilatory support. And according to the estimate in the ICER thing, is that that's on an average of $3,000 per month. I mean, so that's just, it's hard.
Well, I have an idea. Let me just rock it in here for no good reason. Other than, okay, so this is going to involve Chris and patients and insurers. So we need real-world evidence on the use of these drugs in patients who are trached and ventilated. What if the manufacturer said, now that we're getting good insurance coverage across pretty much the board, except maybe there, we provide that drug under a compassionate use where it doesn't cost anything to anybody. The insurers basically have their approach. We can all watch the evidence as it accumulates in a patient population around whom we don't have any evidence right now, but around which there are obviously really both clinical value and economic value questions. So would something like that work for you? I'll actually have to look at Chris mainly, because you guys would have to donate the drug among probably a very small number of patients who are on vents who might want to try it. What do you think?
So I think the development of additional evidence is key in an area like this. It's a new area. We're all learning. I mean, and you hear, as soon as I think, having worked on this for the last 3 years, as soon as I think I know a lot, I meet someone like Brandy and Danielle and realize I don't have a clue at all of the benefits that interventions are able to provide. I mean, there's so many things that get left out of the models and the other things. So then to take votes on is there low value based on the model, it's like, well, the model got it wrong. We just looked at it all day and heard from them. And so I look at that and just think, gosh, we got it wrong. So evidence is crucial here. I met a different patient a few weeks ago. They could only say 3 words before they were out of breath before they started treatment. Now they're working. Now, they would have been considered a failure in the model that was produced today, but they're a responder, certainly. She's working. Her parents are talking about they heard her singing. I mean, these are things that, just have tremendous value. But we need to find ways to measure these things, put value to them. Chris mentioned earlier that there are some things that have been done, but these get left out often in a model. So I completely agree that we need to find better ways to measure these things and ultimately try to find ways to put a quantitative value on them. So absolutely.
Chris, you dodged my question completely.
Not intentionally.
So the question is,
okay,
your
sorry.
money on the table to provide free drug for patients who are trached in the United States, so we can find out every which way we can how much benefit there is or isn't.
Yeah, so what I would say is we're putting a lot of investments into further research in these areas. We have registries going on around the globe we continue to invest in.
Is that a yes? Or
We have a number of trials, and also
I know
where we have coverage policy restrictions, we're still giving double-digit percentages of free of charge vials. And I think the other piece is it isn't that there is no value there. So to me, to say yes in all circumstances, I think would be much, but I would say we're doing an enormous effort here to understand it better as well as there is other programs in our patient assistance, which is providing some level of investment there.
Right. Well, I would stir your creative instincts to think of ways that that could work in a slightly different way. Either a greatly discounted treatment, which I know would make Medicaid best price and all that a problem, so that's why giving it away free is easier than slashing the cost. But an area where patients are maybe very interested in access, but for which there's no evidence and real questions about whether it provides any benefit at all. I mean, there's still real questions about that. It seems like that could be a way for a company that, I think I read you guys, was it 1.7 billion on Spinraza last year?
So I was
Right.
just going to stress one thing, though, which is,
Oh, come on, 1.7, yes or no?
I think, again, and I want to stress the piece of the level of evidence that was talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And I do think it's important, and we had a great discussion earlier on the uncertainty, and Exondys was brought up. And I think there's one thing here, which is we want to incentivize manufacturers, and I think the intention here is a good one, to bring more data, bring
Right.
more evidence at the time of approval. And anything that ICER can do and has continued to do to support that, it changes fundamentally how we develop medicines. And that's where I just think, again, in SMA, with limited data on these treatments, and particularly a new one, we just need to be really humble on what we think we understand and what we fully don't understand.
Sure. Well, I still hope that there could be some cross-fertilization here of interest, opportunity, and agreement to kind of move forward in some way to make that work. Because I think for patients, as I hear it from the clinical experts, if there is a belief that this could potentially be helpful for patients and they want it, and we're talking about Zolgensma if it's approved as well at this point for patients who are on a trach, it just might be the one area where the manufacturers might really need to help get us to that next level, because no one else is going to be able to do that study, afford it, to do it, and we can push against the insurers all day long to give coverage to any patient anywhere, but I think at some point that gray zone for the balance that we need to strike. Anyway, that's my own soapbox. All right, so let me move on. I need to ask one quick question about coverage from the insurers, and then we're going to talk again about pricing and payment, the dessert to this conversation, I hope. Okay, so it's going to be asked, again, will insurers cover the ongoing use of Spinraza for a patient who wants to try Zolgensma? How are you going to manage the sequencing of coverage? Are you going to be hands-off entirely? Are you going to say you have to have tried one and showed signs of failure before you get the other? How are you going to manage that stepwise approach to these two drugs? John?
At this point, I'm thinking we will consider that to be concurrent therapy. And we don't normally cover that unless there is evidence in that specific setting. And by the
So
way,
what if a
for
patient said,
your
I'll stop
earlier-
Spinraza. I'll stop Spinraza to get the Zolgensma. You going to let
Yeah,
him?
that's a different story. And that I think would make sense. To answer your earlier question about these borderline situations, what we do with all patients with Spinraza is we approve fairly easily on the first pass, but we do review these periodically, and we want to see evidence of benefit. And so we're going to continue to ask that question, and if the answer is not something that I can say, yes, it's working, then at that point we cut. It's not like a hard stopping rule where you can just say if it crosses this line, we stop, but it is looked at.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, so that's the question that's kept me up at night. And I think of it in three scenarios, and I'm kind of preparing for it in three scenarios. One scenario hasn't occurred yet, and that's the Zolgensma patient who got the drug early and it didn't work. Hasn't occurred yet.
Right.
Got to prepare for it, and you can't have black and white coverage when a life is at stake. So if there is documented failure, then yeah, they would have access to a life-saving drug. The third scenario is the biggest question about Zolgensma is the durability. So what happens when you have a patient who based on everything that is that this is a type 1 patient and they've got Zolgensma and now it's year 4 and they're showing a decline, which you can assume that the gene therapy is now abated. And if there's no treatment, then that patient's going to revert to a type 1 state with this complication. So I would say that that's a situation that we have to account for. And hopefully any value-based contract that we'll talk will occur for that. The situation where I think I'm going to ask for pharma's help and the treatment community is you've got Zolgensma and then you want more. Like you want to see how far we can push these outcomes. And whether it's Spinraza, whether it's other therapy in the pipeline, I think the treatment paradigm has changed that a new patient born tomorrow is going to go down a treatment path, and that path is not reversible because they're going to have, so now it's what's the treatment on top of, and is that showing us data that's going to support providing that therapy. So that's kind of how I think about it,
Yeah.
and I know there's a lot of what-if scenarios about it, but that's how we're preparing for it.
Just a quick question from the company's perspective, perhaps, and Mary, maybe you know, given that there are now 2 manufacturers involved, I forget how big the patient population is, but are we able to track the outcomes of every single patient in the United States and put them into a single database, or is that still a bridge too far?
We're working on that at Cure SMA. I can tell you that. We have a data registry that we've built, and we really very much want to capture that data and share that out.
Because it
There's
starts
much
to, it
to
starts to
learn.
feel like the kinds of questions that Eric was asking
Absolutely.
about what's going to happen to patients, how many of them who take Zolgensma will have declining function after a certain number of years and may want to seek Spinraza. There's no way we'll know that with that enough kind of power to really understand it unless we really, I think, capture every single patient. Are the companies able to contribute or help in that regard?
Yeah, we've been extremely, I mean, this is a new area, so it's kind of catching up. But
Yeah.
there were registers that existed all over the country. The problem is it's not combined. And so this is a new need,
Right.
and a huge need. So yeah, we've been committed to that and continue to invest in those efforts, both outside the U.S. but also here in the U.S. And would continue to be so, very interested.
Good. Dave?
Yeah, and obviously from our perspective, sorry, Mary, I'll pull it over. Obviously from our perspective, you know, we share the same questions, and we are looking to answer those same questions regarding the long-term impact of our therapies. We have developed a registry. We're working with partnering with the existing apparatus, Cure SMA, and other partners to try to you know, best leverage their organizations, their expertise, without being unnecessarily burdensome, obviously, on the physicians who are putting in the data and their staff. With regards to the question of durability, you know, it's always going to be a question. 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, 50 years out, it's always going to be a question. You know, at this point, patients from our studies are approaching 5 years out following therapy. Dose started in 2014. We're continuing to follow these children, and you know, as the data continues to emerge, we'll be pushing it forward and working with payers and other organizations regarding this understanding of our data.
Okay. Well, in our experience with other topics, other conditions, it actually has proven that it's the patient community that finally pulls this together. And hopefully they have the wherewithal to kind of yank the manufacturers into alignment and the payers, whatever's needed to kind of get this information, because ultimately it really is to the benefit of patients and to everybody if we can learn this.
We consider it a collaboration.
Good. Yanking, pulling, collaboration.
Collaboration.
I guess. All I know is that it won't happen unless the patient community turns up the heat.
But
So that's
we
good.
are building a care center network,
Good.
and with that, patient
That's-
registry.
that's great.
and
That's great.
Rochester's already a part of that. So.
Okay. Okay. Pricing and payment. Ready? Chris? If this drug cost $50,000 a year, we wouldn't be here today. Anybody who raised their hands and says, I think I have SMA and I want to try, would get it. We're here today. And we're not the only group around the world that has said that we've tried to understand the benefits. We've tried to give what we think is the most reasonable approach and even some benefits of the doubt. And we have just no way to make this seem to line up in terms of the pricing with the benefits. And we think that that might create some pressure, not just really within SMA, because we've heard today it's not going to be non-covered, but that this perpetuates a trend across patient groups where they feel trapped because they don't want to push back against it too hard because they want access to it, but they feel the balance issue. In oncology, this is almost like something that came up in oncology a decade ago, and oncology doctors said, we see real financial toxicity playing out for the system and for our patients, and we need to stand up and have a voice here and to say something about this. And it's not that oncology prices have come plummeting down, but there is a concern that as certain treatments move into other clinical areas, there won't be the same pushback, and that the companies know that, and they won't hear from the opinion leaders in that clinical community that the price is too high, and that puts, it takes some of the pressure off. And so I know that we didn't invite you here to defend the price per se, but you heard it's felt as an issue because we know that it's your choice, that you guys literally had a choice. No one made you price it that way. So help us understand how we find a balance going forward. If 10% of the population has rare diseases, if we now start to say that every rare disease, the norm is $300,000 to $400,000 or $500,000 a year, how does that actually work? How are we going to make that work?
So, thanks, Steve.
Now you can do the yes/no if you want to.
First off, I would say, one, it's my responsibility to answer that question, and two, I'm proud to do it. I actually thought it would be the very first question in the policy forum. So when I came back, having some of the conversations come up by the committee, I was ready to go there first, but you chose other topics. So we thought very carefully about this, as you can imagine. This was the first time there's been an intervention. It's the first time there's been a treatment. This financial toxicity component, the fact that health systems around the world and in the US had never paid for new treatments in an area like this, we recognize this could cause both budget uncertainty and also toxicity potentially if we don't do this very carefully. And our principles guide us to do that, but they also guide us to look solely at the clinical evidence that supports the patients. Some of that was captured in the assessment today. But there's a whole host of other things that we included in that, as far as caregivers, the family. This is a condition of the family. There was a piece included in the thinking on that of the community impact. Mm-hmm. Having children in schools enriches that community. We heard a lot of feedback through the process from patients and community as what it means to have someone able to go to class and be part of the environment. Interestingly, we heard earlier, it sounds like it's improved the neuromuscular physicians' quality of life, having new interventions, which we didn't unfortunately capture.
Oh, that's worth a lot.
But there were all sorts of additional things that we included in that. So the question also comes up, well, did you take a cost per quality approach? Did you look at quality? And we looked at, as guidance would say, quality is an important element. But we do feel a number of things are left out of that. And so we have published our own cost per quality models and have used them around the world to gain reimbursement for Spinraza. But we feel like the assessment today really leaves a lot of that out. And that's why the price point that we ultimately selected, we've thought and believe balances that. The other piece I want to stress, which we did take into very serious consideration, and it goes directly to the point, Steve, you brought up, which is, okay, Spinraza, great, but what if there's 50 more? And the piece that we made a very difficult decision in 2014 on was we didn't file for registration with our phase 2 data. And that was frustrating to us, it was frustrating to the community, but it was uncontrolled data.
Right.
There were limited numbers of patients, and despite the fact that we had tremendous optimism from that, we made the decision not to do one phase 3, but 2, and then start a presymptomatic study. So we covered multiple population types. And that was in discussion with health systems, with payers around the world, which were very frustrated by a dynamic which had emerged, which was orphan products coming forward with very limited data against a natural history cohort with no comparison at a single site in one country, and then having a price point that was dislocated from the level of evidence and uncertainty that they had brought. And so our decision to do that made us think very differently. And that also fed in very significantly to our decisions around the price. And ultimately, I've even gotten asked today, why has Spinraza been so successful worldwide? As of this week, we just had our 44th country reimbursing Spinraza. If you look in orphan medicines, the typical process for 2 years out is 3 countries perhaps, maybe 4. I think Orkambi recently celebrated their 10th country after 3.5, 4 years on the market. So people ask me, how did this happen? And I always say it's because of one thing. It's not because Spinraza works so well. It's because we had the evidence to demonstrate that it works so well, and we're able to reduce the uncertainty that so often isn't able to be reduced. And that's how we came to the conclusions that we did. And I feel proud on the decisions. I'm excited to have worked on this program around the world. I'm also very excited that both us as a gene therapy developer and other companies are continuing to innovate in this space. I didn't mention it, but there was a piece and a responsibility that sometimes we don't talk about, which is we were the first in an area that had never had a treatment. If we had failed miserably, we would have ruined the incentives for other manufacturers to follow behind us and create new products. So the fact that we're talking about a new entrant 2 years after, we could be talking here in another meeting in a year with another product and other gene therapies beyond that, to me, I'm extremely proud that that ecosystem still exists based on the success of Spinraza.
All right. So just a couple reflections. One is, I'm sure that the decisions around the initiation of the R&D pipeline, those would have occurred years before you guys bought, was it Ionis? Was the company you bought to bring it to market?
No, we started a partnership with Ionis back in 2010, 2011.
Okay. I'm just saying, so their decisions, in a sense, were predicated upon their own view of a marketplace years later, where they might or might not have assumed that there was a drug for you. And
Yep.
I mean, I can honestly, because we all, I mean, I've seen the documents, they're in the public domain that other companies have shared around how they think about their pricing. And it must have been hard for you guys to a certain extent because you did all the hard work, as you said, working with the patient community to do those randomized trials and to get really, better data in terms of our certainty on the clinical effectiveness. In some ways, maybe this feels like a backhanded compliment, but we have greater certainty that the price is too high, given the benefit. And it feels complicated, but I can imagine that companies, in terms of thinking about the future pipeline, if you knew that there was gene therapy coming that might end up eroding market share, in a sense, you have a narrow window to recoup your investment and to kind of make the right kinds of profits, if you will, to launch further investigations and further efforts. So it creates a difficult market situation, I think, for first arrivers when they know there's a fast follower, because you do have a relatively narrow window. So I think your company, obviously, patients have benefited around the world. And I think they do, I mean, we all feel like in a desert, a real desert that existed beforehand, you guys sunk the first well. And I think the tension is that you guys are selling the water, and it makes people feel like we have to buy your water, but it feels like you've chosen to set a price that feels like, you're taking advantage. Now, I don't say that with any kind of malice or forethought. It is a common concern across, not just orphan diseases, but other areas as well. So I really do want to kind of applaud your company and hope that others follow suit in terms of taking the hard road, the road less traveled, to come up with better data, especially as first to market kinds of folks. But I think it will still create real tension across, kind of not just drugs, but across the healthcare system as we try to figure out how to manage the costs as the next 10, 20 kinds of treatments come online. Doug, I know you can't talk about the price because there isn't one yet, but you can put this on your bulletin board at home. You are the first treatment for which ICER said a value-based price would be over $1 million. Right? Aren't you thrilled? I think you're thrilled. The clinical benefits, the one-time administration, the upper end of our value-based price, whether it's quality or life year gained, is $900,000 to $1.5. I'm not saying where you'll end up. But let's talk about how payers are going to manage that scale of payment, because there's been a lot of productive, at least, thought trying to figure this out, but I'm not sure the market's going to make it in time. Maybe Avexis is going to come in, Zolgensma. We kept calling it Avexis 101 for so long, I still call the drug Avexis. But Zolgensma is going to come on, and we're all going to have thought that we had these great systems for outcomes-based contracting where we'll trace to see if the drug is working really well. We'll be able to spread out the payments perhaps over time. All of that looks good on paper. Is it what you're finding in your discussions with payers? How's this going? Because I'll talk a little bit and they can bring it to the table too, but I'm not sure this is moving fast enough for it to really take root with Avexis.
So obviously, we want everything to be done in a minute.
Right.
And so obviously, we share the pressure that you mentioned. And as you know, product's still under review. The price has not been determined at this point. But and I can't comment on any specific conversations with payers or organizations, but we are working actively and having a lot of very positive feedback. The payers are very interested in talking with us about exploring different payment models, reimbursement type scenarios, outcomes-based payment models, and other approaches to ensure that there's an effective balance between the high upfront cost
Right.
and managing the cost offsets and other benefits that would come down the road.
So I've heard some holdups from some folks, and that is, first off, with the Medicaid best price, it's hard for any company doing an outcomes-based contract to want to put more than about 17–20% at risk on any individual drug for a patient. And I'm sure that's been part of the struggle that you've faced with payers who probably want more money at risk, but you guys have that structural limitation. Am I right? Has that been part of
So
the...
obviously Medicaid is
an issue.
Is an important issue for pricing for all
Right.
companies in this space, and certainly we're working with CMS to try to plot an effective solution that would be most equitable for the system, as well as allowing appropriate flexibility to work with payers to have the most optimum
Right.
optimum set scenarios for reimbursement.
Right. So let's talk about the outcome side, because there too, I think it might seem easy to figure out what an outcome would be that you could track over time and decide if something's not going right, then some amount of money flows back to the payer. But there again, sometimes the devil's in the details. It would be easy to say if a patient starts out not being ventilated and ends up on permanent ventilation, the drug hasn't probably worked as well as we'd hoped. Certainly with the 12 patients, none of that has happened. If they die, right? I mean, there are certain really easy ones, but if we're going to be doing mainly presymptomatic screening and treatment, that means we're going to be treating a mix of type 1, type 2, and type 3. Maybe even some type 4s. Maybe type 4s don't exist until we screen for them, and then we end up feeling like we should treat them. But, when I was reading the guidelines around how to track outcomes, clinical outcomes, and the clinical experts say, we can do the HF, the Hammersmith, we can do the CHOP Intend, we can do the Hines, we can do these. They're not hard to do in the office. We heard from Dr. Cefaloni that you might need to tailor which outcome you would track depending on where the patient is starting and what they're able to do. So you might not certainly want to have a one-size-fits-all, but couldn't we come up with a method in which we did use some of those outcomes, let the clinical expert decide at start which one is the right one to use to trace outcomes, and link the outcomes-based payment to that, whether it's the CHOP, the Hines, or the Hammersmith. Has that been the direction you're heading, or are you still more on ventilation and death?
So that's a remarkably complicated question, multiple iterations. So I think that first of all, the bottom line is that survival, ventilatory, permanent ventilation-free survival are well-established and unambiguous fixed endpoints. And I think having that as the core is of any conversation is the most appropriate place to start. With regard to presymptomatic patients, I think it's important to recognize it was Dr. Cefaloni discussed the questions about where a child with 3 copies would fall, or 4 copies would fall, as far as the clinical spectrum. With regard to children with 2 copies, you can almost take it to the bank that this child is going to be a type 1 child.
Right.
Some of them are very weak sitters, barely type 2s. They have the same complications as a child with SMA type 1. And so I think there's always some variation in medicine. There's no absolutes. It's as close as you get in medicine to an absolute. With regards to outcome measures, obviously it's something that we're eager in working with the community, working with payers. We have to be careful with these outcome measures because there's strengths and there's weaknesses. There's a reason we don't have just one outcome measure.
Right.
It's because There's issues with populations, with ceilings, with age.
So what
Can
would
you
be
do
the
it?
problem with a clinical expert being designated by the payer to identify which outcome should be the one best used for this particular patient, and using that as the basis for the outcome agreement?
Is the clinical expert somebody who would be sitting on a panel like this? And that's the critical question that we have as a community. So we need to make sure that that there is
They're good enough, you mean?
speak
Go
frankly.
ahead. Yes, yes. That's-
That it's my personal belief that there's when you're talking to some of the national experts, two of whom are sitting on this panel, a third person who would be, I would say, an international expert, there's a level of familiarity that's way beyond that you would see with a pediatric neurologist.
So
who
if you
maybe
don't
saw
mind,
one
given
of
time, let me
residents.
just quickly pivot to the clinical experts, because ultimately the payers are going to need your opinion on this as well as in their discussions. So you heard my proposal. The person who's giving the drug, who's been identified as competent to do so by the payer in addition to others, gets to pick the outcome measure that would be tracked to follow the progress of the patient with a pre-existing standard of what kind of failure means. Are those measures is there a way to say that those are reproducible enough that it can be done by the majority of clinicians, or all of them who are going to be giving this drug, or is there a real reason for concern that you wouldn't be able to implement it?
I think a couple of things. Yes, putting real experts in a room and trying to come out with some criteria will be obviously very sensible. The problem is that, yes, we have scales that are pretty good, definitely good, across a wide range of ages. But not everything that we currently are able to measure is necessarily meaningful, and many things that are meaningful we don't have scales for yet. In SMA, it is a new field in a way. We have done very, very few trials in SMA. Right. And when it comes to type 2 and 3, our natural history and outcome measures are also, they could definitely use some improvement. So yeah, you can put the best expert in the world in a room, and there will still be some unknown or challenges just related to the lack of data, but that will be a very good start. And we've already seen that with the newborn screening published guidelines. When you get to a certain situation, they're split 50-50. But this is not unique to SMA. In other newborn screening programs for other pediatric diseases, look what happened with Pompe. When you start identifying presymptomatically, there are many challenges in when to start treating. Pompe is a good example, and there are other programs.
So I'm not talking about the when anymore. I'm actually talking about in these arrangements that payers are very interested in striking when it's a one-time treatment at a very high price, of wanting to have some way to track clinical progress. Each clinician would do this whether there was an outcomes-based agreement or not. And the question is whether for type 2s and 3s in particular, do you feel that the clinical community is up to tracking their clinical progress using the existing measures or not? Because that's the ultimate question. Are there existing measures that you would get to pick? Because we know there are multiple ones, but let's say you get to pick which one you want to use as the best measure of whether this patient is getting worse or not through time. Is that possible?
Yeah, and I think especially as our mindset is changing to the treatment of presymptomatic patients, the level of disagreement among us is going to be pretty minimal about what we think we can measure accurately and what would constitute failure. We've had a harder time talking about already severely disabled patients and the marginal benefits that we can see that are not well measured by our current scales. But if we're starting with an infant that is asymptomatic and we're following their developmental progress, I think the currently frequently used scales are going to be fine.
Okay. Now I'm going to have to cut it short there because you're right, that could have been a whole afternoon by itself. All right, so I've poorly found the balance that I was talking about earlier in the time I have spent on this roundtable, because what I'd like to do is to give you each a chance to have a final statement, but we are scheduled to end at 4 o'clock. So you're going to have to make up for my bad finding of a balance by, if I can ask you, what we would love is to know what one thing would you hope is a takeaway theme or message that is hardwired into our report in its final version. Often that can be also a request. I encourage people to think, if you had to ask one thing of one of the stakeholders, represented here, that you think would be really critically most important to making the world a better place in the future, what would it be? What's the one thing, and of whom would you ask it? So if you could do that in one sentence, your final message and or a request, I'm going to give you just 10 seconds to think about what that's going to be, and then we're just going to run the line. Okay. Doug, I will start with you, and then we'll go this way.
So I think from
That's one sentence, I'm sorry. Okay. Shoot.
I think having a balanced perspective on the need to create an appropriate apparatus, an appropriate framework for reimbursement of ultra-rare diseases remains a critical need as a society, making sure that we ensure access for all patients affected by ultra-rare diseases.
Thank you. Mary?
And I would support that. So from a Cure SMA perspective, our ask is that everyone in this space work together to create access for all patients to these new transformative therapies.
Thank you. Danielle?
Well, I would say, moving forward, if you are someone who makes decisions that affect us, take a catalog for 1 hour of things that you do, anything that you do, and then drill that down to the steps that have to get to you doing those tasks for 1 hour. And remember that those are the meaningful things. Walking, sitting, while they're great to be measured, that's really not what I look for as a parent. That's just not what I look for. So just think about those things that we don't think of often, and then you'll be kind of in our head, and you'll be heading in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Randy?
Ditto. Too much going on in my brain. I don't believe that any family should have to suffer what we did because of the availability. So I guess I would be to reiterate what Dr. Schroe said, that I hope that everyone in this room will work together to allow access yesterday, because every day is motor neurons.
Thank you. Emma?
I think that what's happening in SMA is revolutionary in the scientific way. If you think of 50 years of trying to develop gene therapy for serious diseases, this is, one of the very first. I mean, we only have one other gene therapy that is available for blindness. So I just hope that when we look at this as a society problem, that with the issue of pricing, that we don't put extraordinary new science like nusinersen and Zolgensma in the same class of some other product where prices has been extremely high for products that are really not new science or that require a lot of work and manufacturing cost, and that we are able to distinguish what new science that, has really cost quite a bit to get there versus other drugs. So the pricing has been very much in the media, but I think that we cannot put everything in one basket and really realize the value of what has gone into these amazing new therapies.
Thank you very much. David?
Can I say ditto too?
Yeah.
Very well said. So I also want to just use my time to thank you guys for bringing us here and for putting so much emphasis on the patient and caregiver perspective and the physician perspective on the values that are difficult to capture and the context that the value-based decision is put into. We're very excited to be working with these revolutionary drugs and to be providing real benefit to our patients, but we are worried about access and what pricing and reports like yours might do to the long-term plans of other companies trying to go into this field. It's almost too much for anybody to consider, but you guys are tackling that tough work, and we applaud you for that.
Thanks very much. Chris?
Yeah, so I think first off, thank you. This has been extremely rewarding day, especially having everyone here. I think my one piece would be, this is a time to be excited, but it's also a time to be very humble with regards to how much we understand and what we're still learning, and I would just encourage that as we go forward. And the request then would be, Steve, to you and your team who's put so much energy into this assessment and report with help from a lot of people I recognize, would be in the report, please ensure that the signals that it sends, the conclusions it reach, incentivizes drug developers to come to seeking approval with more data, not less.
Thanks. John?
Yes. And the one thing I haven't heard today, we've talked about registry for these patients. It's great that Cure SMA is taking that on. But if you think one step farther back about all the other diseases like this that are coming down the pike and will have gene therapies soon, how about an NIH-funded program that would provide registries that would collect all the data, ensure that it's curated, that it's available to researchers? We might actually find that what we learn from disease A might apply to some other diseases, B, C, whatever. Hopefully some general principles will arise out of this. The issue of antibodies to the vector is a good example.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Sure.
Thank you, Steve. And again, I just wanted to note my appreciation for the innovations that these products provide. I think that we're at a state where with this new gene therapy and different value-based contract ideations, it represents a tremendous opportunity for partnership between manufacturer and payer and payer for portability concerns, and even the treatment community and the manufacturer and treatment community and the payer. There's a tremendous opportunity that we should think outside the box, and as you said, devil's in the details. I think that as you know, the word cure has come out. I hope that is close. I think it may be a little premature based on the actions that we think of. And I think an opportunity with an outcomes-based contract or outcomes-based assessment, whether it's this condition or other conditions as a payer, we've heard from physicians that some of the day-to-day responsibilities of tracking outcomes, tracking scales and stuff is arduous to them. And I can think of a threefold aspect to tell us whether these drugs are changing lives. And that's, you know, the event-free survival stuff that's hard outcomes that no one wants to have to deal with, but it's easily trackable. But then the third function of an assessment of outcome is essentially the truth serum that comes from the physician's actions and the family. And that would be, you know, if someone's got Zolgensma and 2 years later the physician has decided to go down a different treatment path or an additive treatment path, that's something that needs to be accounted for, because the biggest question is durability. And if we want to assume 100% durability, then the cost can be astronomical and we'll never be able to recoup that.
All right. Thank you very much. And that was a long sentence, but that was pretty good. A shrewd use of semicolons is what I have to say. All right, we are at 4 o'clock, and I really know that so many people need to leave right at 4 o'clock, but I'm going to, I want the CEPAC, if you have something you'd like to say to send us off, let's go around, and unfortunately have to be incredibly brief. But I also understand if people need to leave to catch a plane. So let's start with Jason, and if you have something to say, please do.
Steve knows I'm not good at brief. Just thank you all. I mean, I've been kind of CEPAC for 4 years now. I'm just constantly struck by how rigorous and detailed these reports are. So thank you to the ICER staff, the clinical experts who've been so insightful, representatives from insurers and manufacturers, and again, just thank you again for the patients. I have to beyond overwhelmed with how hard this must have been, how scary this is, and I'm also overwhelmed by how you guys have transformed your own personal pain into something that helps other people. So thank you, and I'm so glad that these new options, it sounds like options soon, are going to be available for this community. It's so important. Thank you.
All right, I have to catch a train, not a
Yes.
plane, so I'll make this brief, and with apologies, I'll leave right after. It's been actually surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, but an unusually emotional day listening to the patient representatives and all the issues. I'm looking forward to seeing my kids tonight, actually. So in a way, thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to say was I struggled, I think maybe other people struggled with the sparsity of data on one of the drugs here. And it's not just on the outcomes, but on the price. Obviously, we don't know it. So that made value for money on both sides of the equation obviously basically impossible. We didn't try to tackle it, but that's a real big challenge, and something to think about going forward, how we're going to navigate in a space where we're getting our data is getting thinner and thinner.
Thanks. Steve?
Thanks to Brandon and Danielle in particular. It was, first and foremost, your perspective was inspiring, and thanks so much for adding so much to our discussion today. Just wanted to say, too, it seems like the pharmacoeconomic analyses are always under the most scrutiny when they're unfavorable, and yet it's perhaps a threat to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think the ICERs tell a story within an order of magnitude of what the true story is. And we should have confidence in the modelers and the results that they generated for us.
Thank you very much. Stephanie?
I just want to say thank you to everyone, but in particular, again, thank you to Brandy and Danielle. I really appreciated hearing your thoughts and your perspective, and I learned a lot, so thank you.
Yeah, as you go around the table, it gets harder to come up with something new to say. So thank you to you guys. Thank you to Mary. I actually had a very nice discussion with Mary at one of the earlier breaks, and the video I saw of a child walking a couple of years ago when I was at an American Thoracic Society meeting was tears to the eyes, absolutely sort of thing. But, and I'll say this to Chris, it's Chris, right? I can't see your name tag from here, but I still worry a lot about how the price gets set, and I think there's a lot of obfuscation, and we need a whole lot more transparency from the whole pharmaceutical industry about pricing. And that disturbs me tremendously because I think that's what gets in the way of access more than anything else.
Thanks. Chris?
Thank you very much for your bravery, patient representatives, and for all of you who are here. I think especially the modelers who are doing a fantastic job on sensitivity analyses and all of the behind the scenes stuff. But if there's one thing I'd like to leave on a note of hope, collaboration. I think that's just a great opportunity to speak with one another, to use your collective networks towards improved innovation at an affordable price tag.
At the risk of sounding extremely redundant, thank you again for sharing your stories. They were very impactful. I think I'm going to use my semicolon to just echo what Eric and John have mentioned from the payer perspective. I think and from what you saw in our voting, nobody is questioning the efficacy of these drugs. I think where we're struggling is the affordability and sustainability, because it's not just SMA, it's all these other rare diseases that we're tackling as payers. And so I do think that part of the solution is going to be pairing up with the manufacturers to truly come out with value-based outcomes, to stand by your drug, and to also think of all the unique patient situations that we talked about today during the policy roundtable. So I think it's a great time to work together.
Cost drives access, and if we want patients to have access to life-altering medications, we need to keep our eyes on costs.
Thank you, Chair. You take that one sentence to heart. I appreciate it.
It's a haiku, Steve.
Haiku. All right, so guess what I get to do? I also get to not just thank, but actually just acknowledge the extraordinary contributions of the folks at the front table. And as I did mention at the very beginning, this sense of needing a balance can only really start if we draw from the heart of those most closely involved what it is really like to live with a condition and what the benefits of treatment look like to them and their families. So not only for being here, for sharing your personal stories, but just for the broader perspective and the impact that you need to have. Because without meetings like this, in all the different rooms where insurance companies and manufacturers are going to be talking about coverage and price, they need to hear this. And I hope that through this meeting and through what we can put in the final report, we do that justice. So to you and to the entire policy roundtable, our fantastic clinical experts, you could take care of my kids if it's a runny nose or anything. They're coming to you. Can we give them a round of applause? My thanks to the ICER staff who helped do the incredible review of the literature, Alex and the rest of her team, the modeling, coming all the way across the ocean to be here with us today, but fantastic colleagues, to the folks who helped with the logistics of today's meeting, to all of you who came and spent the day listening and learning with us and who are watching online. Thank you. And again, I'm not going to try to close with some grand wise pronouncement, but just to say that it has been a moving day because the balance is always going to be tough to find, but it feels even more important when it involves the kinds of positive, heart-rejoicing news that the introduction of these drugs have brought to families. So congratulations to the manufacturers, to the payers who will work to make this accessible within 48 to 72 hours after a diagnosis. And yes, we can't leave the balance issue without a focus on the price, which will continue to be a real concern. And the fact that, again, that the companies are coming and engaging with this process and willing to say, we think the value is, the price should be linked to the value to patients and families and society, and here's how we think it should be measured, and that is so much better than we've brought good things to life, and we need more for innovation, and in some kind of broad statement claiming that any price goes. So I applaud you for that, and I hope you will continue a collaborative path because I think the country needs it so that patients can benefit from future treatments like this and have excellent, excellent access. So thank you and safe travels to all of you.